The reservation was quiet, bathed in the dim glow of the setting sun. Aiyana stepped carefully through the dry brush, her basket full of roots and herbs she had gathered from the forest. She was 17, and though the elders had long warned the younger generation to respect the wilderness and the spirits that lurked within, Aiyana had never truly believed in those old stories. At least, not until today. The wind shifted suddenly, stirring the leaves around her feet, and she froze. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, a primal instinct she couldn't explain. A strange scent filled the air, like something rotten, something dead. She turned slowly, eyes scanning the tree line just beyond the ridge, and that's when she saw it. A wolf stood on the crest of the hill, but not like any she had seen before. It was enormous, its eyes glowing in the fading light. But what struck Aiyana the most were its eyes, too human, too knowing. They bore into her, freezing her where she stood. The creature's head tilted slightly, and for a moment it almost looked like it was smiling. Aiyana took a step back, her heart hammering in her chest. The creature didn't move, but its presence felt suffocating, like it was watching her every breath. Without thinking, she turned and ran, her feet pounding the earth as the basket of herbs fell forgotten to the ground. She didn't stop until she reached the small house she shared with her grandmother on the edge of the village. She burst through the door, slamming it behind her, gasping for breath. "Aiyana, what's wrong, child?" Her grandmother's voice came from the back room, raspy with age. The old woman shuffled out, leaning on her cane, her dark eyes sharp despite her years. "I saw something," Aiyana said, her voice trembling. "In the woods. A wolf, but it wasn't normal. Its eyes—" Her grandmother's face darkened instantly. She hobbled to the door, locking it with a heavy wooden bar, then pulled the thick curtains shut across the windows. "Tell me exactly what you saw." Aiyana described the creature in halting breaths, her mind still racing from the encounter. When she finished, her grandmother was silent for a long time, her face unreadable. "You saw a skinwalker," the old woman finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "It has found you." A chill ran down Aiyana's spine. Skinwalkers. She had heard the legends, stories passed down through generations. They were witches, once human, now twisted and corrupted by dark magic. They could change their form, taking the shape of animals, even people. But they were hunters, predators of the worst kind, feeding on the fear and flesh of those they pursued. "Why would it be after me?" Aiyana asked, her voice barely audible. Her grandmother shook her head. "The skinwalkers do not need a reason. They are drawn to those who are vulnerable. But once it has marked you, it will not stop. You must be careful now, child. Do not show it fear. And whatever you do, do not leave the house after dark." Aiyana swallowed hard, but the knot of fear in her chest only tightened. The skinwalker's eyes had seen into her soul. She knew it wasn't going to stop. That night, Aiyana lay in bed, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. The house felt too quiet, the walls too thin. Every creak of wood, every whisper of wind outside made her heart race, her mind conjuring images of glowing eyes and sharp claws waiting just beyond the door. Her grandmother had said not to show fear, but how could she not? The stories of skinwalkers were things she had brushed off as tales meant to scare children into behaving. Now they felt all too real, and that terror gnawed at her, deep and raw. Then, just as she began to think she might drift off, it started. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Her eyes shot open. The sound came from the window, slow and deliberate, like something dragging its claws across the wood. She sat up, her body tense, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard. Aiyana pulled the blanket to her chest, not daring to move, straining to hear. Thump, thump. Something heavy landed on the roof. Her breath hitched. She could hear it moving slowly, deliberately, right above her head. A strange noise followed, like something sliding along the shingles, a grotesque, wet sound, too close for comfort. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Do not leave the house after dark." But what about when the darkness came for you? The scratching at the window became more insistent, more aggressive. Aiyana wanted to cry out, to scream for her grandmother, but fear kept her frozen, locked in place. Slowly, she turned her head towards the window, her eyes widening in horror as she saw it, a shadowy shape, just beyond the glass. The moonlight caught the edges of its form, something too large and twisted to be human, but not fully animal either. It was watching her. Aiyana clapped her hands over her mouth to stifle a scream. The creature outside leaned closer, its breath fogging the glass, revealing the outline of a face that almost looked human, except the features were wrong, distorted, twisted like a reflection in a nightmare. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The creature's form melted back into the darkness, leaving only the stillness of the night behind. For a moment, Aiyana thought it might be over, that maybe it had left. Then came the voice. Aiyana. It was her grandmother's voice, clear and strong. Aiyana, come out. Aiyana blinked, confused. Her grandmother's voice was calling to her from outside. How was that possible? The old woman never left the house at night. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. Something felt wrong, like a warning deep in her gut. Aiyana, child, I need you. The voice came again, pleading, urgent. She slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. Aiyana crept toward the window, glancing back at the door to her grandmother's room. The old woman hadn't moved. She was still asleep, breathing slowly beneath her blankets. But how could her grandmother be inside and also outside? She reached the window, her hand trembling as she pulled the curtain aside. Her breath caught in her throat. There, standing at the edge of the yard, was her grandmother, or at least something that looked like her. The figure was draped in the familiar shawl, her hair silver in the moonlight. But the way she stood, the way her head tilted slightly, was wrong, unnatural. Aiyana, come. The voice was insistent, but now Aiyana heard it for what it was, a hollow echo. Not her grandmother's voice at all, just an imitation. The skinwalker was trying to lure her outside. Her blood turned to ice. She dropped the curtain and backed away from the window, heart racing. She had almost fallen for it. If she had stepped outside, she didn't even want to think about what would have happened. Thump. The sound came again, this time from above. It was still there, waiting, stalking. Her grandmother had told her these creatures were relentless once they found a target. It would keep coming until it wore her down, until she made a mistake. The night dragged on, every second stretching into eternity. Aiyana huddled under her blankets, her ears straining for any sign that the skinwalker had left. But the silence was worse. It was a waiting game now, and she didn't know how long she could hold out. Morning came like a blessing, the first rays of sunlight piercing the gloom that had settled over the house. Aiyana hadn't slept, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She waited until she heard her grandmother moving in the kitchen before she finally dared to get up. You heard it, didn't you? Her grandmother asked quietly when Aiyana joined her. The old woman didn't need an answer. The dark circles under Aiyana's eyes told her everything. I didn't go outside, Aiyana said, her voice shaking. But it sounded like you. Her grandmother nodded, her face grim. They do that. They take the voices of people you trust, of those you love. They want you to step outside, to give in. Aiyana swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the table. What does it want from me? Her grandmother's eyes were sharp, though laced with sorrow. It wants what it always wants, to feed. It feeds on fear, on chaos. But it's more than that. You've been marked, child. It has claimed you. Aiyana felt a wave of nausea at those words. Claimed? The old woman nodded. It will come again tonight and again the night after that. Each time, it will grow bolder, more dangerous. But why me? Aiyana's voice rose with panic. What did I do? Her grandmother hesitated, then spoke softly. I never told you this, but our family, there's a curse. A long time ago, one of our ancestors turned to dark magic, became one of them, a skinwalker. That corruption has stained our bloodline. They come for us, for those of us who are spiritually weak. Aiyana's heart sank. She was being hunted because of something that had happened generations ago, something she had no control over. But the fear, the vulnerability the skinwalker thrived on, that was real, and it was inside her now, gnawing at her with every breath. Is there any way to stop it? Aiyana asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her grandmother's eyes flickered with something close to regret. There are ways to fight it, to protect yourself, but stopping a skinwalker for good, that's much harder. Aiyana felt the weight of those words settle on her chest like a stone. The fear was thick, almost suffocating, but deep beneath it, something stirred, anger. If the skinwalker was going to keep coming, if it was determined to take her, she wouldn't just sit back and wait for it. She would fight. The day passed in a haze. with every minute pushing Aiyana closer to the inevitable darkness. As the sun sank behind the mountains, a creeping sense of dread filled her. The skinwalker would return. Her body was tense, muscles coiled as if bracing for an attack that could come at any moment. Her grandmother worked tirelessly through the day, preparing. She scattered sacred herbs around the perimeter of the house, whispering ancient protection chants under her breath, her wrinkled hands moving with a precision that belied her age. She instructed Aiyana to follow along, repeating the words and placing small talismans by the windows and doors. "These will slow it down," her grandmother explained, her voice steady but laced with concern. "But they won't keep it away forever." Aiyana felt the weight of those words press down on her. She nodded, swallowing her fear. She wouldn't be caught off guard again. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the reservation plunged into a thick, unnatural silence. No wind. No sounds of crickets or birds, just stillness. The kind that pressed against your skin and made your heart beat faster for reasons you couldn't explain. The first sign came not long after, the whispering. It started softly, a faint murmur just outside the house. At first, Aiyana thought it was the wind picking up, but there was no movement in the trees, no rustle of leaves. The whispering grew louder, the voices multiplying, swirling around the house like a storm. They weren't speaking any language she knew, but the intent was clear. It was mocking her. Aiyana sat at the table, her fists clenched. "Ignore it," her grandmother said sharply. "It wants you to listen. It wants you to break." But it was getting harder to block out the sounds, especially when the voices started taking on familiar tones. Her grandmother's voice, her mother's voice, even her own voice. It was relentless, each voice speaking in perfect imitation, driving icy spikes of fear through her. Then came the thud. Aiyana jerked in her seat as something slammed against the front door, hard enough to rattle the frame. The house groaned under the impact. Her heart leapt into her throat, her pulse quickening. Thud. Another strike, this time harder, more insistent. The door creaked under the pressure, but it held. Aiyana could feel the presence just on the other side. Hungry, angry. It was testing their defenses, pushing to find a weakness. Her grandmother moved to the door, raising a hand over the wood. She began chanting again, the same protection prayer she had used earlier. For a moment, the pounding stopped, the whispers fading back into the night. Aiyana dared to breathe. Then the window behind her shattered. Glass exploded inward, spraying across the room. Aiyana screamed and threw herself to the ground, her arms covering her head. The skinwalker was inside now. It had broken through. In the chaos, she caught a glimpse of it. A towering figure, hunched and grotesque, its body shifting and rippling as if it couldn't decide on a shape. One moment it looked like a wolf, the next a man twisted in unnatural angles. The face was the worst, human features, but hollow, blank, like a mask stretched too tight over something inhuman. "Aiyana!" Her grandmother's voice cut through the panic. "Get to the back room, now!" Aiyana scrambled to her feet, glass crunching under her shoes as she bolted for the small back room. Her grandmother stood in the living room, hands outstretched, blocking the skinwalker's advance. The talismans at the windows and doors were glowing faintly, the protection spells holding, but barely. The creature let out a low growl, its voice deep and rattling like bones scraping together. Its eyes locked onto Aiyana, glowing with hunger. "It's here for me," she realized, cold dread washing over her. Without thinking, Aiyana grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a sharp kitchen knife, and held it out in front of her, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She knew the blade wouldn't stop it, but it made her feel less helpless. The skinwalker lunged. Her grandmother threw something, a handful of sacred ash, directly into its path. The creature howled in pain, its form flickering and distorting, as if the ash was burning through its flesh. It staggered back, momentarily stunned, but Aiyana knew it wasn't over. "Into the woods," her grandmother shouted. "Lure it away from the house or it'll tear this place apart." Aiyana's heart raced. She knew what her grandmother was asking. She had to draw the skinwalker away, put herself in its path to protect her home. It wasn't a question of courage anymore. It was survival. With a deep breath, she threw open the back door and bolted into the night. The air outside was thick and cold, the darkness swallowing everything beyond the dim light from the house. Aiyana ran, her feet pounding the dry earth, her lungs burning with every breath. Behind her, she could hear the creature following, its heavy, uneven footsteps crashing through the brush. It moved unnaturally fast, closing the distance between them in seconds. Aiyana darted into the trees, using the narrow paths only she and the village children knew. Her body was running on pure instinct now, driven by fear and the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The skinwalker was close. She could feel its presence looming behind her, a cold shadow that clawed at her with invisible fingers. She pushed herself harder, weaving between the trees, her vision blurring as branches whipped at her face and arms. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way. Aiyana tumbled down a steep embankment, her body crashing through the underbrush, the world spinning around her. She hit the ground hard, pain shooting through her side, knocking the wind out of her. She lay there for a moment, gasping, trying to force air back into her lungs. Her body screamed at her to move, to get up, but everything hurt. She could hear the creature above, snarling, searching for her. The air around her grew colder, thicker with its foul presence. With a trembling hand, she reached for the knife still strapped to her waist. The handle felt cold and heavy in her grip. She knew the knife wouldn't stop the skinwalker. It wasn't a weapon meant for such a creature. But it was all she had. She stood slowly, wincing at the pain in her ribs. The skinwalker's eyes found her almost immediately, its form slinking down the embankment with terrifying ease. It didn't rush. It didn't need to. It knew it had her cornered. Aiyana held the knife out, her breathing ragged. "Stay back!" she shouted, though she knew her words were meaningless. The creature didn't fear her. It reveled in her fear. The skinwalker let out a low growl, a sound that rumbled through the earth beneath her feet. Its body shifted again, the bones snapping and cracking as it took on a more grotesque form, larger, more monstrous. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and Aiyana knew she was out of time. In a desperate move, she remembered her grandmother's chant, the protection spell. The words came to her lips without thinking, spilling out in a rush as the creature lunged. "Hashta yokai, naashjei hashta yokai." Her voice wavered, but she kept going, her hands shaking as she clutched the knife. "Leave this place." The skinwalker recoiled for a brief moment, its form flickering, as if the chant was pulling at the edges of its reality. Aiyana took a shaky step back, her voice rising in desperation. "Hashta yokai naashjei hashta yokai," she shouted again, louder this time. The skinwalker let out a deafening roar, its body contorting in agony, but it wasn't enough to stop it. The creature lunged forward, its claws outstretched, and everything went black. Aiyana awoke to the sharp sting of cold wind against her face. Her body ached, every inch of her screaming in pain from the fall and the chase. The world around her was a blur of darkness, the thick forest closing in from all sides. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, her heart pounding in her chest as she remembered the creature, the skinwalker. She wasn't dead. Not yet. The creature's roar echoed through the trees, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. It was close. She scrambled to her feet, ignoring the pain that flared in her side. The knife was still clutched in her hand, though she knew it wouldn't be enough. Not against something like this. Aiyana's mind raced. Her grandmother's words came back to her. The skinwalker feeds on fear. It wasn't just a physical battle. It was a battle of wills. If she gave in to the terror that clawed at her, it would be over. The shadows around her shifted, and she caught sight of movement through the trees. The skinwalker was there, stalking her from the darkness. Its eyes glowed faintly, watching her with that unsettling hunger. It no longer looked like a wolf, nor like a man. It was something between, something twisted and monstrous, its body elongated and wrong. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the sounds of mocking voices. Her mother's, her grandmother's, even her own. It was playing with her, savoring the fear. Aiyana clenched her jaw, gripping the knife tighter. She wouldn't let it have the satisfaction. Without thinking, she bolted through the trees, her heart racing. The forest was a maze of dark shapes, the branches clawing at her like skeletal hands. She could hear the skinwalker following, its footsteps unnaturally fast, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. Aiyana's breath came in ragged gasps, her body burning with exhaustion. She could feel it getting closer, the cold breath of the creature brushing against her skin. Panic surged inside her, but she shoved it down, fear would only make her weaker. Then, in the distance, she saw it, a break in the trees, a clearing. And beyond that, the old stone circle, an ancient place of power where the tribe had once gathered for ceremonies. It was said to be sacred ground, a place where evil spirits couldn't cross. It was her only hope. She sprinted toward it, her legs screaming in protest. The skinwalker was right behind her now, so close she could almost feel its claws reaching for her. The chanting words her grandmother had taught her spilled from her lips again, barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Hashta yokai, naashjei, hashta yokai. The creature let out a furious roar, and Aiyana could feel the air around her grow colder, thicker with its presence. It was almost on her. She dove into the clearing just as the skinwalker lunged. The creature's claws grazed her back, tearing through her shirt and leaving shallow cuts across her skin. She stumbled, but managed to roll into the center of the stone circle, gasping for breath, the pain searing through her body. For a moment, everything was still. The skinwalker stood at the edge of the clearing, its body tense and coiled like a predator ready to strike. But it didn't move. Its glowing eyes were fixed on her, filled with a hatred so intense it made her blood run cold. The stones were working. The sacred ground was holding it back, for now. Aiyana stood slowly, her legs trembling. She knew this was her chance. She couldn't outrun it, couldn't hide from it. The only way to survive was to face it, to banish it back to the darkness it had come from. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "You are stronger than you think, Aiyana. Trust the spirits of our ancestors. They will guide you." She had to finish the chant. It was the only way. The skinwalker snarled, pacing at the edge of the stone circle, its form shifting and twisting in the moonlight. It looked like it was trying to force its way through the invisible barrier, but the sacred ground held strong, for now. Aiyana raised the knife, not as a weapon, but as a focus, and began chanting louder, her voice carrying over the wind. "Hashta yokai, naashjei." She repeated the words, feeling them resonate in the pit of her stomach, in the air around her. The power of the chant wasn't in the words themselves, but in her belief, in her conviction. The creature howled in fury, throwing its head back, its body convulsing as if in pain. The ground beneath it began to tremble, the air around them growing heavy with an oppressive, unnatural force. "Hashta yokai," Aiyana shouted again, her voice filled with all the fear, anger, and desperation she had bottled up inside her. The skinwalker roared in response, its eyes burning with an intense, malevolent light. It lunged again, slamming against the invisible barrier, claws scraping the air. The stones flickered with energy, and for a moment Aiyana thought it might break through. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She kept chanting over and over, each word growing louder, more powerful. The air seemed to vibrate with the force of her voice, the wind howling around them in a cacophony of spiritual energy. Suddenly, the skinwalker's form flickered. Its body rippled, shifting and contorting, as though it were being pulled apart by an unseen force. It let out a deafening screech, its hands clawing at the air as if trying to grasp something solid. The ground beneath it cracked, and a dark, swirling mist began to rise from the earth, enveloping the creature. Aiyana's heart raced as she saw the creature's form begin to disintegrate, its twisted limbs fading into the darkness. The chant was working. She was banishing it. But then, just as it seemed to be fading completely, the creature's eyes locked onto hers. For the briefest moment, she saw something behind the hatred, something familiar. A flicker of recognition flashed across its distorted face, and Aiyana's breath caught in her throat. The skinwalker wasn't just some random spirit, it was something, or someone, connected to her. A long-buried memory stirred in the back of her mind. Something her grandmother had said about their family's curse, about how skinwalkers could once have been part of the tribe. Could it have once been family? The thought hit her like a punch to the gut, but she didn't have time to process it. The creature let out one final, bone-chilling scream as its body was consumed by the dark mist, its form collapsing into nothingness. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the mist evaporated, leaving the clearing silent and still. Aiyana stood there, her chest heaving, the knife trembling in her hand. The skinwalker was gone, but the weight of what she had seen, the flicker of familiarity in its eyes, left her shaken to her core. The silence in the clearing was deafening. The night had returned to normal, the air no longer thick with dread. But Aiyana couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. She had banished the skinwalker, but its shadow still lingered in her mind. She slowly lowered the knife, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. The adrenaline that had fueled her escape and confrontation was fading, leaving her feeling weak and hollow. The pain from her injuries surged back, but she forced herself to focus on getting back to her grandmother. The walk through the forest felt surreal. The once terrifying trees now just shapes in the darkness. The fear still lingered, but something had shifted inside her. Aiyana had faced the worst of the darkness, and she had survived. When she reached the house, she found her grandmother waiting at the door. The old woman's face was pale, but her eyes were filled with pride and relief. "You did it," her grandmother whispered as Aiyana stumbled into her arms. "You banished it." Aiyana nodded, her voice too hoarse to speak. She knew the battle was over, but the image of the skinwalker's eyes, those strangely human eyes, would haunt her for the rest of her life. Aiyana sat by the fire the next evening, her body still aching, but her spirit calmer. Her grandmother hadn't spoken much about the events of the previous night, but Aiyana knew she didn't need to. The look in her grandmother's eyes said enough. They both understood the weight of what had happened. "You felt it, didn't you?" her grandmother asked quietly, stirring the fire with a long stick. "You saw who it was." Aiyana swallowed hard, staring into the flames. "It was someone from our family, wasn't it?" Her grandmother nodded slowly. "Long ago, a member of our family gave themselves to the darkness. They became a skinwalker, and ever since, the curse has followed our bloodline. But you faced it. You broke the cycle."